Thank you, Ray, and I appreciate the honor of being with you here today and impressed by the turnout for this wonderful meeting here. So anyway, thanks a lot. I'm going to try to divide my talk into two portions, sort of a worm's eye view, if you will, of my involvement on the 22nd of November with President Kennedy's treatment, and then on the 24th of November with the treatment of Oswald. And I think what I will begin with is to tell you where I was on that day, around about noon. I was in the operating room at Parkland Hospital showing a film of how to repair a hiatus hernia to some of the senior residents there at Parkland at that time. And I heard a little tap on the conference room door where I was showing that film. And I went to the door and looked out, and standing out there by the door was Dr. Chuck Crenshaw, who was one of our senior surgery residents. And he said, "Dr. Mack, would you mind stepping out here? I need to tell you something." And so I did. I went in and turned off the movie projector and stepped outside. And he said, Dr. Crenshaw said they just called the emergency room and said that President Kennedy has been shot during his motorcade downtown, and they're bringing him to the emergency room now. So I said, well, my God, I hope that's not true. Well, we went and got on the elevator there in the operating room, went 2 floors down to the emergency room. As we were riding down, Dr. Crenshaw and I were trying to, I think, encourage one another, saying that, well, we often get calls to the emergency room saying that they're bringing in some catastrophic event. And when we get down there, it's really not as bad as they said it was going to be. With that, the elevator door opened into the big pit area, about 50 by 50 square feet, in the emergency room there at Parkland that was lined with patient cubicles. And the first thing that I saw when I stepped out of the elevator was that that area was jammed with people from shoulder to shoulder, men in business suits. And I thought to myself, I've never seen anything like that. And then with that crowd spontaneously parted so that I could look down through the little corridor that they made toward trauma room 1, trauma room 2, 3, and 4, which were on a little hallway off of the pit area there at Parkland. And sitting on a folding chair outside of trauma room 1 was Mrs. Kennedy in her bloody clothing. Well, that, of course, just horrified me to see that. I was 2 days after my 34th birthday at that time, second year on the faculty at Southwestern, and it also immediately occurred to me that my chief of surgery, Dr. Shires, was in Galveston at a meeting of the Western Surgical Association, so he was not there. And I also thought that my 2 cohorts on the surgery faculty, Dr. Charles Baxter and Dr. Malcolm Perry, probably at that time of day were outside of the hospital, up and down Harry Hines, trying to get a hamburger to avoid the Parkland food at that time. And what that meant was that I was the quote-unquote senior surgery resident or resident faculty there. I had to literally force myself to continue walking down toward Mrs. Kennedy, where she was sitting. Standing by the doorway to where she was Mrs. Doris Nelson, who was the nurse in charge of the emergency room at that time. She was standing between 2 Secret Service men and letting them know who to let go by or not. So they motioned me on through. I went by Mrs. Kennedy, walked into trauma room 1, pushed the door open, and was also horrified when I saw the first thing that hit my eye was President Kennedy lying on his back on a cart with his face toward the door and an operating room light shining down on his very bloody head. I was also, after I saw that, gratified to see that I was not alone, that Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter had just walked into the room right before I did, and they had not been out of the hospital. Dr. Perry, as I walked by the left side of the cart, said, "Bob, there's a wound here in his neck, just to the right of the trachea and just above the sternoclavicular junction. And it looks like an entrance wound. But we're concerned about the carotid artery, and so we're going to put in a trach and we're going to explore the artery at the same time. Incidentally, I might add that the very first person, medical person who saw President Kennedy as he rolled into the emergency room was Dr. Jim Carrico, who at that time was a first-year surgery resident on permanent duty there in the emergency room. So he got the call that they were bringing the president in and was standing there with an endotracheal tube and a laryngoscope so that as soon as the president rolled in, he could intubate him. And that's what happened. As soon as he came in, he intubated the president and rolled him back into trauma room 1, where we saw him. So that was the very first person who saw President Kennedy was Dr. Carrico, whom we've mentioned here several times, and who subsequently became the chief of our department. Many years ago, that was how things had changed in that time. So anyway, I went into the room, went by Dr. Perry on the left side of the cart that the president was lying on, and he reached across and handed me an Army-Navy retractor and said, "Bob, would you go and stand at the head of the cart and lean over and put this retractor in the extension of the incision we're going to make to explore his carotid artery and also replace the endotracheal tube with a tracheostomy." I took the retractor and went to the head of the cart next to Dr. Jenkins, who was our professor of anesthesiology at that time, and he had come down with a high-brick anesthesia machine and was breathing for the president. So I stood by him and found myself looking directly into the president's wound in the back of his head. He had a wound about where I'm placing my hand, far in the back of his head, that was probably at least 5 inches in diameter, where the whole back of his skull had been blown out, and the right half of his cerebral hemisphere was gone. And as soon as I arrived there, just at that time, the right half of his cerebellar hemisphere fell out of the opening onto the cart. I'm emphasizing that a little bit because some of the drawings that appeared in some of the descriptions of that wound later showed it farther forward on the head, still in the back, but farther up on the top. And that was not the case. It was very far in the back of the head. And what that, I think, subsequently I came to believe from having viewed the Zapruder film, indicated that the second shot that hit him had come from behind the picket fence, entered somewhere around the hairline, and blown out the back of his skull. So I asked Dr. Perry, I said, "My goodness, have you seen this wound in the back of his head?" And he said, "No, we hadn't had a chance to do anything, but just walk into the room and see this wound in his neck." And I said, "Well," I described to him what I just did to you, what's back here. Well, with that, Dr. Clark, our neurosurgery professor, had at that point come in and was standing by the electrocardiographic monitor that had been attached to the president when he came into trauma room 1. And just as we got to completing the incision in the neck, and I began to lean over and put the retractor into that incision, Dr. Clark looked at the ECG monitor and told Dr. Perry, he said, "Mac, you can stop now because he's gone." The president had, some people have asked, wasn't he really dead when he entered the emergency room? And I guess you could say that certainly that was going to be the ultimate thing that happened. But despite that terrible injury, he was making agonal attempts to breathe and had good cardiovascular signs at that time. But anyway, very quickly into this, he did have a cardiac arrest, and initially somebody suggested that maybe we should do closed chest massage on him, but everybody said there's no point in doing that. So with that, the large crowd of people that had assembled in front of room 1 then pressed out of the room and left. And in so doing, they pushed the gurney that the president was lying on against the wall of trauma room 1, and that trapped Dr. Baxter and me between the gurney and the wall. So we had to wait there until everybody else left the room. And then finally, when they had left the room, we pushed the gurney away and were about to leave ourselves when the door of trauma room 1 came open and a priest came in. We later found out that this was Father Huber, who had been summoned to give the president last rites. So we would have had to push him out of the way to get out of the room, and so we again, Dr. Baxter and I, froze against the wall of trauma room 1 and just stood there, feeling out of place, but not feeling that we had any way to easily get out without pushing Father Huber out of the way. So we were unwitting and unwilling witnesses of the president's last rites. What happened there is Father Huber pulled the sheet off the president's forehead, anointed him, and the only thing I could hear him say when he leaned over to the president's left ear, he said, "If thou livest," and then I couldn't hear anything else. He completed the last rites and was closing his little satchel up that he had the material in that for the last rites. And as he did that, the door opened again to trauma room 1, and Mrs. Kennedy came in and walked over to the gurney to where the president was lying at his head, and just next to Father Huber, and across the gurney from Dr. Baxter and me. I don't know what she said, but from the context, because she spoke in such a low voice, I couldn't hear her. But from the context of Father Huber's answer to her, I assumed that she asked him if the president had received last rites. With that, Father Huber said, "Yes, I've given him conditional," and he sort of stressed the conditional absolution. Mrs. Kennedy, when she heard the word conditional, grimaced a bit, but didn't say anything. And she stood there for a few moments at the head of the gurney next to the president, next to Father Huber, and she exchanged the ring from her finger to the president's finger, and a ring from his finger to her finger. And then she stood there for another few moments, didn't say anything, was very composed, very dignified, impressive lady under those circumstances. She walked down to the foot of the gurney where the president's right foot was protruding out from the sheet, and she stood there for a moment and then leaned over and kissed his foot and walked out of the room. And that was the last we saw of her that day at Parkland. Pardon me. With that, Dr. Baxter and I hastily left trauma room 1, and we went back up to the operating room and sat down there looking at one another as if we had just been in a bad dream. And shortly after that, we had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Rose, who was our forensic pathologist at the time at Parkland. And he told us that he had been sitting in his office adjacent to the corridor that led from the emergency room area out to the loading dock. And as he looked out the window that looked into that corridor, he saw the president's body, which had now been placed in a casket from the O'Neill Funeral Home and placed on the gurney, and was being rolled out toward the ambulance that was parked at the back of the loading dock. And in front of the gurney, as the president was being rolled out, were 2 Secret Service men, one of whom was carrying a Thompson submachine gun. Mrs. Kennedy was walking along the left side of the gurney, and several of the president's friends, Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powers and some others, were walking along on the other side of the gurney across from Mrs. Kennedy. Dr. Rose said when he saw that, he got up out of his office chair and walked out into the hallway in front of this procession that was heading down to the ambulance, and held his hand up and told him, he said, I am required by law to let you know that any murder that's committed in the state of Texas, the victim must undergo a pathologic examination here in the state. Dr. Rose said with that, nobody said anything to him, but the Secret Service man who was unencumbered by the machine gun walked over to Dr. Rose, who was not that big a man, but he was not small, but the Secret Service man was, he said, considerably bigger, and he slipped his hands underneath Dr. Rose's armpits, lifted him up off the floor, and placed him over against the wall of the corridor, and shook his finger in his face, and turned back, and they proceeded on out to the ambulance and carried the president back to Love Field, to Air Force One, where he was flown back, and the postmortem was done that evening at the Naval Hospital rather than at Parkland. So that's what happened, that we saw, as I said, a worm's eye view of the activity on that day that the president was brought to Parkland after he was shot.